Hello and welcome to the next video where we're digging into our MITRE.py script and finishing it up here. All right, so in the last couple of videos, we first created our MITRE object so we can have some easily accessible, usable data. And then we have something similar for the files that we care about that we want to iterate through and make some checks on. So now that we're using this alert_data object here, what we can do is just see how this is going to run. We have the files getting listed as we'd expect. Okay. We could dig down one more layer and see what happens here. We can see all our values getting output individually. So now what we want to do, similar to what we did up here, is declare some variables to make all the data more easily accessible in our checks. So we're going to say tactic equals tactic.lower. And I'll explain why I wanted to do that in a second here. We can do technique ID. And we could do subtechnique ID. And just testing this out here, what we can do, similar to the previous couple of videos, is print out the data. Make sure to fix. All right, so we have a file, tactic, technique ID, and subtechnique ID. And we can see everything listed out nice and neat here. All right. So now what we want to do is to run some checks. I'm imagining we want to check to make sure that whatever MITRE tactic that engineers are putting in is correct. We want to make sure the MITRE technique ID is valid. We want to make sure that the MITRE TID actually lines up with the name. We want the same thing for the subtechnique ID. And then we want to make sure if the technique is deprecated or not. Okay. We're going to dig into each of these individually. Let's look at the tactics for our first problem to solve. Okay, so there's only so many tactics that we need to check for. If we go back to our matrix, we can see all the tactics lined up here. Or you can have this list out here. So what we're going to do is create an array with all these values so we can check against that field. So I'm going to actually declare this up here. And I copied and pasted this from my notes just to save some time here. So we did allow none to exist up here. If you didn't want to allow none and you wanted to enforce tactic use, you can get rid of that and just have the tactics that you care about. And scrolling over, we can see that all the tactics are represented. Okay, to make this check, what we can do is say if tactic not in the MITRE tactic list, and we're going to print an error statement out here. I'm actually going to copy this from my notes to save some time. So what we're just saying is that the MITRE tactic supply does not exist. We're surrounding the tactic in quotes, and you have to escape the individual quote to make that happen. And then we're going to say in what file that it's contained in. So let's run this. We have no hits, so let's make this happen. Going into our Posh audio capture, we can go to one of the tactics here, and let's just call it collection 2. And there we go. It identified that collection 2 was not a valid tactic. And now we have some tactic validation. Going to remove that for now. All right, moving on to the next item of business. Let's look at the MITRE technique IDs and make sure they're valid. Okay, so we're going to do something called a try except statement. So essentially what it's going to do is try a certain action, and then if it errors out, do something. Okay, so we're going to say if MITRE mapped technique ID exist, you can continue on to the next check. But if there's a key error, that means that lookup failed. And we're going to print this statement here. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is using the technique ID, which is found via our alert data, see if that technique ID exists within MITRE mapped. And we know that this should work because MITRE mapped is using the technique ID as the key to access the data. So what we can do is run this just to make sure it doesn't error out. It doesn't. And let's go make a change here. So let's look at command and scripting interpreter, call this T with a bunch of X's. And there we go. Invalid MITRE technique ID, T and a bunch of X's in the exact document. Let's revert that back. All right, now we want to check to see if the TID and name combination is valid. Okay, so this one's getting a little bit more complex here. And we're going to do another try except. So we're going to say that we need a variable called MITRE name. And we're going to need a variable called alert name, and then we're going to compare the two. Okay, so MITRE name is in our MITRE map data. And that's based off of the technique ID, and then should be name. And then alert name should just be the technique name in the current line. And now we're just going to say, if alert name does not equal MITRE name, print an error statement. And I'm going to copy and paste this from my notes. So what we're going to say here is print technique ID and name mismatch. And then it's going to give some of the values. Okay. And we're going to give an example here. All right. So before we set up the example, I didn't like my indentation. There we go. So what we can do is just tack on a 2 to one of these technique names. And essentially what's happening, it's going to take this ID, look up that ID and the MITRE data that we built previously, and then return back if it's okay or not. And it's definitely not. All right, so we have MITRE technique ID and name mismatch in file name, gives you the expected value, and then it gives you the value that we put in the document. Set this back. All right, now we're going to do pretty much the same thing for the subtechnique ID. Okay. The big difference here is that subtechnique ID can't be none. And then what I'm going to do is grab this chunk, fix my indentation problems. And then let's fix the lookups here. Okay, this should work. Let's look at one of our sub techniques. So let's say PowerShell 2. Give that a run. And that didn't work quite how, oh, you know what? Here we go. All right, so this is interesting. We have 2 hits here. We have this PowerShell 2 that we just edited. All right, but let's fix that because I want to focus on what we found here. So it's actually finding an error from the Elastic alert itself, which is really interesting. Okay, so it's expecting email collection, but it's given local email collection. So what's going on here? So let's look at this email Outlook mailbox alert. All right. So email collection, where is that? That's right here. And we can kind of see the problem if you look at it for a little bit here. So when we're talking about sub techniques, there's a piece of data after the TID that it needs. Okay, so let's go to this link. So this is the TID of a sub technique. It needs that .001. Okay. And if we look back to our documentation, we can see it's actually only declared as the parent technique, which is a problem. Okay, and just as a point of comparison, if we go to this PowerShell one, we see the .001 here. So what we're actually finding is an error within Elastic's own rule set. Okay, so what we can do to fix that is just save this off and rerun it. And now we're returned clear. All right, so that was a fun one. Okay. Next up, we're going to check to see if the technique is deprecated. And this is one of our easier checks. Okay, we're still going to do a try except. We're going to look based off of the technique ID. And then look to see if it's deprecated. Get the deprecated field. And we're saying if that field returns back true, we're going to print out this error statement. If we run this, nothing should return back. But why don't we go find a deprecated alert? We can use as a test. And I think I found one earlier to make this a little easier. So we have MITRE deprecated is true. And we need the TID here, T1026. So let's go back to our script. And let's throw this in right here under email collection. All right, now we're finding 2 things here. We're finding a name and mismatch, which makes sense. If we want to do this the right way, I would just put in the name there, but I'm not too worried about that for our example. So this is what we're looking for. It does a check on the TID and finds that value is deprecated. At this point, we have a pretty fleshed out script here that we're going to use more in the future. This video marks the end of the complicated Python videos we have in this section of the course. We're definitely going to do some more working with the Elastic API, but I want to thank you all for sticking with me this far. Hopefully we've learned a couple things here and showcased the flexibility of writing your own custom validation scripts. While it can be a little bit tedious, it showed some problems with the out-of-the-box solution from Elastic, and it also let us customize it exactly how we wanted it. I'll catch you in the next video.